It was a Tuesday, the 11th of October, 1983, a day that began with the kind of crystalline autumnal morning that Kentucky residents would later recall with a nostalgic ache, a day so perfect it seemed physically incapable of hosting the rot that was about to take root within the small, trusting community of Havenwood, a town nestled so far into the rolling, tobacco-dotted hills of Oldham County that its proximity to the greater metropolitan sprawl of Louisville felt more like geographical irony than neighborly connection, a town where the volunteer fire department served as much as a social hub and pillar of civic pride as it did an emergency service, where everyone knew everyone else's truck, preferred coffee order, and their parents' lineage back at least 2 generations, a false sense of security woven into the very fabric of its existence, preparing to be violently unraveled. The sky was an impossible, deep lapis lazuli, scrubbed clean by the cold front that had moved through the night before, dropping the temperature from a humid 75 degrees down to a crisp 48, an atmospheric condition that carried the promise of wood smoke and pumpkin patches, a classic October morning perfect for high school football practice and the final harvesting of late-season vegetables, but also, as fate would cruelly prove, a morning perfect for an unthinkable act of calculated malice, the cold air preserving not only the scent of fallen leaves, but also the faint, almost imperceptible traces of the chemical accelerant that would soon be the central, agonizing mystery, the anchor point of a case that would defy resolution for 40 years, leaving a permanent shadow over the community's cheerful facade. On that morning, 3 men, bound together by the unforgiving rhythm of the alarm and the singular, life-affirming camaraderie of running toward danger, were preparing for their shifts at Station 1, a cinder block and brick structure that smelled perpetually of diesel, drying hose, and cheap coffee. Men who were more than colleagues. They were the very lifeblood of their respective families, community pillars whose absence would create voids of almost cosmic significance. And those 3 men were Captain Tommy Rourke, a broad-shouldered, gentle-eyed man of 35, a second-generation firefighter, whose wife, Sarah, was due with their 3rd child in December, a man burdened by the silent, noble responsibility of leadership, a detective-like acuity for reading a burning building, a father known for his booming, infectious laugh and his quiet, almost monastic commitment to his faith, a man whose life was a perfectly weighted scale of duty and devotion, a scale that would soon be violently, irrecoverably tipped. With him was First Lieutenant Sam Jenkins, 28, a lanky, nervous energy bundled into the uniform, a master mechanic who could coax another 6 months out of a failing engine with nothing but a wrench and sheer force of will, an individual whose meticulous attention to detail in the apparatus bay was a stark contrast to his disheveled bachelor apartment, a man who saw the fire department as his true only family, a quiet soul whose loyalty was absolute, an orphaned son of the department who wore his badge like a sacred trust, his singular focus on the technical mastery of his craft, masking a deeper, almost pathological need for belonging. And finally there was probationary firefighter Danny Hayes, 19 years old, barely out of high school, a kid whose uniform still bore the creases of the packaging, whose face held the hopeful, unblemished idealism of youth, the son of the town's beloved former mayor, a boy still smelling faintly of college acceptance letters, and a future that felt as boundless as the blue Kentucky sky, an earnest, hard-working young man for whom the roar of the engine was the sound of destiny calling, a nascent career tragically interrupted before it could truly begin, a symbol of potential extinguished before its prime. Tommy, the captain, was in the kitchen, carefully brewing a pot of his signature dark roast, a ritualistic act of preparation that centered him before the unknown demands of the day, the rhythmic grinding of the beans, a temporary, soothing counterpoint to the distant possibility of the alarm's shriek, a sound that always meant someone else's worst day, a sound he was trained to answer with calm competence, the smell of the coffee mingling with the faint metallic scent of ozone from the radio, a smell as familiar and comforting as his wife's perfume, a smell that spoke of his chosen life, a life of service and immediate consequence, a life that, for a precious few hours, felt blessedly ordinary, a fragile tranquility that was about to be violently shattered by a call of unimaginable gravity, an incident that would forever cleave the town's history into a clean before and a contaminated after. Sam, the lieutenant, was already under the hood of Engine 3, his body contorted in a practiced choreography of maintenance. the low, tinny sound of a college football pre-game show emanating from the dusty radio perched on his toolbox, the click of his socket wrench a rhythmic percussion against the underlying silence of the sleepy station, a man immersed in the solvable, predictable world of machinery, a haven from the messy, unpredictable nature of human existence, his grease-stained hands methodically tightening a fuel line that had been causing a minor, intermittent sputter, a small, controllable problem that provided a satisfying sense of mastery, unaware that the truly unsolvable, the truly messy, was rapidly converging on their coordinates, preparing to introduce a level of chaos that no amount of mechanical expertise could possibly address, a systemic failure of human decency and community trust. Danny, the rookie, was in the back bay, struggling with the cumbersome task of repacking the 2-inch attack line, the heavy, waterlogged hose resisting his efforts to coil it tightly and evenly, a task more about endurance and physical control than finesse, his youthful exuberance momentarily dimmed by the sheer labor of the job, but his face still held a proud, determined expression, his mind already running through the checklist of the morning drill, the theoretical application of the J-bar and the Halligan tool, the abstract knowledge of what it meant to enter a structure fire, a knowledge that was about to be made terrifyingly, irreversibly concrete, a baptism by fire that would be his last, an experience that would redefine the word tragedy for everyone who knew him and for the entire population of Havenwood. The call came just before 7 a.m., the exact time of 6:52:34 seconds, an arbitrary moment of statistical precision that would later be endlessly scrutinized in darkened evidence rooms, a moment when the stillness of the autumn morning was ripped apart by the deafening, insistent electronic screech of the station's alert tone, the sound immediately snapping the three men into a pre-programmed, practiced flurry of motion, a visceral reaction that bypassed conscious thought, the kind of professional response that had been drilled into their musculature, a coordinated, wordless ballet of duty. The automated dispatch voice, detached and emotionless, relayed the preliminary details. Structure fire, residential, 1421 Sycamore Ridge Road, confirmed entrapment, multiple victims. Repeat, structure fire, residential, 1421 Sycamore Ridge Road, confirmed entrapment. The address, Sycamore Ridge Road, immediately registered with a sickening familiarity to Tommy Rourke, a wave of cold dread washing over him that had nothing to do with the heat of the fire, for that address belonged to the Reverend Elijah Thorne, the beloved pastor of the Havenwood Community Church, a man whose sermons were known throughout the county for their soothing spiritual reassurance, a gentle, scholarly man who lived there with his wife and 2 young children, a family whose very existence was a testament to the quiet, devout morality that the town prided itself on upholding, a family who had just 2 weeks prior attended a department picnic, the children gleefully sitting in the cab of Engine 3, a memory that flickered across Tommy's mind with the agonizing speed of a bullet. Within 90 seconds, which felt simultaneously like an eternity, and the blink of an eye, the 3 firefighters, their bunker gear donned with an economy of movement that only years of practice can confer, were in the cab of Engine 1, the massive vehicle's diesel engine roaring to life with a concussion that shook the entire station, the air horn's primal, mournful blast echoing off the nearby brick buildings, signaling to the sleepy town that the protectors were now in motion, responding to a crisis that was, for the moment, still an abstraction, a red light on a map, a volume of smoke and heat, but which was, in reality, a funeral pyre in the making. As Tommy expertly guided the heavy apparatus out of the station bay, merging onto the still quiet main street, his mind was already constructing a 3-dimensional mental model of the Thorne residence, a 2-story colonial on a slight rise overlooking a small stream, a property he knew well, having visited it countless times for community events and once for a routine chimney inspection, the layout now becoming a matter of life and death. Every window, door, and staircase a potential point of entry or a fatal obstruction, the knowledge both a terrible advantage and a crushing burden. Sam was already on the radio requesting mutual aid from the county and a full medical response, his voice clipped and precise, his focus strictly on the logistical demands of the incident, using the mechanical rhythm of the protocol to wall off the creeping emotional awareness of who the victims were, the personal connection, a paralyzing distraction he could not afford to acknowledge until the professional demands were met. Danny, the rookie, sat silently between them, his knuckles white against the railing, his eyes wide and fixed on the flashing emergency lights reflecting in the passing storefront windows, the smell of burning rubber and diesel fumes filling his nostrils, the sound of the siren a terrifying, all-consuming shriek, his theoretical training dissolving in the face of the imminent, terrifying reality, the sheer velocity of the engine and the urgency of the moment a kind of physical shock, the transition from the mundane repetition of the morning's chores to the brutal immediacy of a confirmed entrapment call, a violent, irreversible break from his former life, an instant of pure existential terror and adrenaline that marked his true entry into the brotherhood of the line, a line he would never live to cross back over. The drive to Sycamore Ridge Road, a winding 3-mile journey that normally took 5 minutes, felt like an odyssey, the rising sun now a sickly orange glow through the thick column of black smoke visible even from a mile away, a grim, unmistakable beacon of catastrophe that grew darker and wider with every second that passed, a visual testament to the horrifying head start the fire had achieved, suggesting a fuel load far greater than what a typical residential fire would generate in such a short time frame, a sickening observation that Tommy Rourke registered with a cold, professional dread, a red flag fluttering in the back of his mind that he immediately suppressed, focusing instead on the practical exigencies of the response: water supply, apparatus placement, immediate primary search, the rote, life-saving calculus that stood between the burning structure and the people trapped inside. As they rounded the final bend onto the ridge, the scene that confronted them was one of absolute, terrifying devastation, a spectacle of destruction that defied the idyllic setting of the suburban street, the Thorne house not merely on fire, but fully engulfed, a raging, monstrous inferno with flames licking 20 feet above the roofline, punching a massive hole through the cold morning air, the heat radiating outwards in a palpable wave that hit the cab of the engine before they even came to a stop, the structure already compromised, the second floor a roaring, collapsing cage of fire, and standing on the lawn, silhouetted against the blinding, chaotic light, were several neighbors, their faces masks of horror and helplessness, their silent, wide-eyed stares conveying the crushing reality of the situation more eloquently than any shout could have, the terrible, paralyzing knowledge that they had done all they could, which was nothing at all against this brutal, overwhelming force. Tommy expertly positioned Engine 1 to maximize the reach of the initial attack lines and simultaneously allow access for the incoming ladder truck, a decision made in a split-second high-stakes assessment that confirmed the worst. This was not a save, this was a recovery, maybe, a desperately thin hope that still demanded immediate, unflinching action, for the faintest chance of life trumped the certainty of death every time. He slammed the gear selector into park, the air brakes hissing, and before the truck had even fully stopped, he was barking orders, his voice raw but controlled, cutting through the din of the fire's roar and the neighbors' quiet sobs. "Sam, get the 5-inch supply line laid. Charge it from the nearest hydrant, then assist with the 2-inch attack line. Danny, you're with me. Grab the irons and the Halligan. We're making a primary search through the side door, low and fast. Stay on the hose line. Keep contact, and don't lose sight of the exit. We have confirmed entrapment. Let's go." It was the final command of his life, a direct, unequivocal order that his rookie protégé immediately and unquestioningly obeyed. Grabbing the heavy, intertwined tools with a surge of adrenaline, the weight of the steel a familiar reassurance in his trembling hands, the two men moving in a blur toward the roaring inferno, bound by the solemn, unspoken oath of their calling, moving toward the blinding heat and the choking, toxic black smoke with the professional discipline of men who understood the terrible calculus of their profession. Sometimes the greatest act of bravery is to go where hope has already died, but where duty still demands a search. The moment Tommy and Danny plunged into the maelstrom, their entry point a side door near the kitchen, violently forced open by Tommy's precise, brutal swing of the Halligan bar, the external world dissolved into an immediate, overwhelming sensory assault, a transition from the manageable reality of the yard to the anarchic, internal devastation of the fire, the black smoke inside a 3-dimensional, suffocating entity far thicker and more corrosive than anything they had encountered in the sterile, controlled environment of the training tower, a smoke so dense it completely annihilated the concept of visual orientation, instantly reducing their world to a primal reliance on touch, sound, and heat, forcing the veteran captain and the terrified rookie to navigate by the unfamiliar contours of the house's interior walls, feeling their way along the baseboards, the thin, reassuring line of the charged attack hose, their only tether to the outside world, a fragile lifeline connecting them to Sam Jenkins, who was now a silent, determined presence at the pump panel, meticulously managing the water pressure, his focus a clinical shield against the emotional horror unfolding just 50 feet away, listening to the static lace transmissions from the helmet radios, his entire being a high-tension bridge between safety and the inevitable catastrophe, the air around him vibrating with the shuddering exertion of Engine 1. Inside, the heat was a physical, aggressive force, a living presence that pressed against their insulated bunker gear with a painful, searching intensity, an oven-like environment that indicated the fire had long surpassed the flashover point in the main living spaces. The temperature differential between the floor and the ceiling, a terrifying gradient, necessitating the low-crawling position that Tommy insisted upon. A desperate strategy to remain beneath the rapidly descending thermal layer, the one place where survival, even momentary, was still a scientific possibility. The air at knee level still marginally breathable, a precious, finite resource rapidly being consumed by the roaring combustion above them. Tommy, moving with the practiced, economic movements of a man who understood the architecture of collapse and the language of burning timber, maintained constant verbal contact with Danny, his voice a low, steady rumble of authority and focused instruction, a sound anchor in the auditory chaos of the fire, the sickening, wet-sounding whoosh of the rapidly expanding fire, the ominous, creaking groans of the compromised structural members, the distant, terrifying smash of a window yielding to the differential pressure, each sound a tiny, terrible piece of information contributing to Tommy's ongoing mental calculation of risk and reward, of time elapsed versus search area covered. Stay low, Danny. Keep your left hand on the wall. Check the floor for openings. Listen for life. We're heading for the main staircase. Priority 1. The young man, Danny, despite the overwhelming fear that clawed at the edge of his professional training, the terror of the heat and the blindness threatening to consume his composure, remained disciplined, forcing himself to follow the captain's instructions with a desperate rote compliance. The heavy weight of the tools he dragged behind him, a paradoxical comfort, an immediate tactile connection to his purpose, his mind, frantically ticking through the search patterns he had memorized. The horrifying realization that the actual fire was an infinitely more complex, faster-moving, an unforgiving entity than the controlled scenarios of their training, the smoke stinging his eyes, even behind the face shield, the air he sucked from his self-contained breathing apparatus tasting faintly of rubber and plastic, a thin barrier between his lungs and the deadly atmosphere of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide that filled the home. They reached the foot of the main staircase, or rather the area where the staircase had been, the structure now a terrifying ruin of charred, unstable wood and collapsed drywall, the fire having originated, or at least rapidly migrated to, the foyer and living room, effectively cutting off any direct ascent. The heat here so intense, it was beginning to cause the synthetic fabric of their protective gear to blister slightly, a silent, sickening warning that their time inside the inferno was reaching its hard, critical limit, a moment of crushing strategic failure that Tommy immediately and ruthlessly internalized. The crushing weight of the Thorne family's fate resting squarely on his shoulders, the fleeting image of the Reverend's smiling face from the picnic flashing in his mind, immediately discarded in favor of a new, desperate tactic. Plan B, Danny. Back out to the exterior. We'll attempt the master bedroom window on the second floor with the aerial. Tommy's voice was strained. The forced change of plan, a terrible confirmation of the fire's devastating progression, the need to retreat a professional defeat that was simultaneously a life-saving necessity, the instinct for self-preservation warring with the desperate urge to push further into the core of the devastation. They began their agonizing, slow-motion retreat, crawling back along the hose line, the few feet they had gained feeling suddenly like 1,000 miles, the fire behind them gaining strength, its sound increasing from a steady roar to an enraged, predatory howl, the heat now radiating through their backs with an almost unbearable intensity, pushing them toward the only remaining exit, the side door they had entered through, the air in their SCBA tanks alarmingly low, the pressure gauges dropping rapidly, the unforgiving mathematics of their air supply, adding a new, critical layer of pressure to the already impossible situation. They were within sight of the side door's frame, the faint geometric shape of the opening, a promise of life. When the house delivered its cruel, final judgment, the sound a low, subterranean whoomph that was immediately followed by a catastrophic, cascading wave of structural failure, the accumulated thermal stress finally overcoming the integrity of the second floor, a significant portion of the burning ceiling and roof crashing down into the central living room, sending a blinding horizontal blast of superheated smoke, embers, and burning debris through the narrow kitchen hallway where they crawled, a terrifying flash fire event known in the profession as a hostile fire phenomena, an unpredictable act of structural retribution. Tommy, propelled by instinctual, decades-old muscle memory, immediately roared, "Mayday! Mayday! We've got a collapse! Danny, hit the floor! "Get flat," and he shoved the rookie down and covered him with his own body, the heavy, thick fabric of his bunker coat offering a brief, utterly inadequate barrier against the searing, concussive force of the collapse-induced backdraft, a self-sacrificial act of pure, selfless bravery that was simultaneously the final, fatal mistake. The collapsing structure acted like a massive piston, forcing a fresh, explosive volume of flame and superheated gas directly into the hallway, a fatal surge that caught Danny's exposed left leg, the intense heat instantly penetrating his gear, causing a catastrophic, localized burn that made him scream a high-pitched, inarticulate sound of pure agony, a sound that Sam Jenkins heard crackle over the helmet radio outside, a sound that instantly transformed the lieutenant's professional detachment into a paralyzing, blood-freezing horror, the raw, unfiltered cry of a human being in extremis, the terrible sound of the young man's idealism meeting the brutal reality of the inferno, the signal immediately dissolving into a wall of static, and the unending, hollow roar of the fire. Tommy, momentarily dazed but miraculously shielded from the worst of the blast by his own protective posture, the wind knocked from his chest, his ears ringing, felt the agonizing, involuntary tightening of Danny's grip on his arm, and then the terrifying, instantaneous loosening of the hold, the dead weight of the rookie slumping against him, no longer moving, no longer responsive, the sudden, terrible silence of the younger man, an immediate, gut-wrenching confirmation of the worst, an abrupt end to the bright promise of his future, a death not on the front line of a heroic save, but in the chaotic, internal mechanism of a building's final surrender. The pressure from the collapsing floor had shifted the entire structure, and a section of a load-bearing wall, weakened by fire, gave way and slammed down, pinning Tommy's left leg at the shin, a crushing, immobilizing weight of brick and plasterboard that immediately trapped him, severing his connection to the exterior, the pain a searing, blinding, white-hot spike that cut through his adrenaline, replacing the urgency of the rescue with the cold, immediate reality of his own, impossible survival. He was now alone, immobilized, trapped in the hallway, the only sound the high, steady hiss of his rapidly depleting SCBA tank, the rhythmic mechanical breathing of the apparatus, a macabre, mocking counterpoint to the absolute stillness of the young man whose life had just been extinguished against his chest, the final, agonizing seconds of the captain's life, beginning to tick away with the merciless precision of a forensic stopwatch, the weight of the debris, a physical manifestation of his final, crushing failure. He screamed into his radio, a primal, desperate, non-professional sound stripped of rank and procedure. The word Mayday, a raw, choked prayer, a sound that was only faintly, intermittently heard by Sam Jenkins outside, overwhelmed by the crackle of static and the monstrous noise of the fire's crescendo. The lieutenant, already moving with desperate, unauthorized speed to deploy the ladder for an external search, a frantic, solo effort spurred by the devastating knowledge that his two friends, his only true family, were gone, swallowed by the collapsing house, the terrible, haunting cry of the rookie echoing endlessly in the deafening emptiness of his mind, the 11 o'clock news segment already writing itself in the devastating smoke pouring out of the two-story colonial. The radio silence that followed the faint, broken mayday was an immediate, crushing blow to Lieutenant Sam Jenkins, a silence far more terrifying than the fire's roar, replacing the noise of professional chaos with the sickening, internal clamor of utter, paralyzing dread, a sound vacuum in which the only discernible noise was the violent, hungry consumption of the Thorne residents, the wood and drywall screaming their final, fatal surrender to the conflagration, a silence that confirmed the worst, that his captain, his mentor, Tommy Rourke, the man whose counsel and steady leadership had been the bedrock of Sam's own career, and Danny Hayes, the bright-eyed, trusting rookie who had looked up to Sam with almost familial reverence, had been swallowed by the structure, their vital signs extinguished, their professional lives terminated in a catastrophic fraction of a second, leaving Sam, the meticulous mechanic, the quiet logistical mind, stranded alone at the pump panel, his duty to maintain the water flow suddenly rendered meaningless by the abrupt termination of the human element he was supplying. He stood rooted for a moment, the heavy, vibrating apparatus beneath his feet, a massive, inert monument to the failure of their carefully planned operation, his mind struggling to reconcile the immediate, tangible reality of the roaring fire before him with the abstract, unbelievable finality of the voices he would never hear again, the loss and immediate, physical pain that caused him to double over momentarily, gasping for air against the thick, acrid smoke that billowed violently over the yard, the stench of burning insulation and human hope, a corrosive assault on his senses. The paralysis was brief, however, the ingrained, automatic discipline of the firefighter asserting itself with a primal, self-preserving urgency, demanding immediate action in the face of absolute disaster. The protocol for a confirmed firefighter down, overriding all personal grief, turning the lieutenant into a cold, clinical engine of emergency response, driven by the absolute necessity of recovery, an urgency compounded by the arrival of the first mutual aid units, a flurry of red trucks and helmeted figures from the neighboring Clarksville department, their flashing lights slicing through the thick pre-dawn smoke, the confusion of their arrival demanding immediate authoritative direction. Sam, forcing his voice to remain steady and professional despite the emotional earthquake consuming him, immediately relinquished the pump panel to the newly arrived Clarksville lieutenant, his words clipped, precise, and devoid of the terror he felt, stating only the necessary facts. 2 men down, structural collapse, last known location interior hallway, side entrance. We need immediate RIT deployment and heavy shoring equipment. The primary structure is completely compromised. Go defensive on the east wall immediately. We can't lose the exposure. The rapid, technical jargon, a temporary, necessary shield against the incomprehensible tragedy. His own focus narrowed instantly to the external scene, the impossibility of a rescue now yielding to the grim, necessary ritual of recovery, the retrieval of his 2 fallen comrades, the immediate priority shifting to the exterior walls where Tommy had indicated the second attempt would have been made, knowing that time was not merely running out for his men but that it had already run its course. And what remained was the necessity of bringing them home with dignity, an absolute duty that transcended the brutality of the scene. The fire, feeding hungrily on the already weakened wooden skeleton of the house, reached its devastating zenith, the heat so intense that the first arriving crews had to deploy a defensive master stream immediately to prevent the flames from spreading to the neighboring properties, the water hitting the blazing structure with a deafening hiss, turning instantly into massive clouds of scalding steam that momentarily obscured the scene, creating a surreal, vaporous curtain of destruction, a visual metaphor for the impenetrable nature of the tragic events that had transpired within. Sam oversaw the exterior reconnaissance with a weary, practiced eye, directing the placement of the aerial ladder, the focus now not on extinguishing the blaze, which had become a losing battle against the building's own terminal consumption, but on suppressing the fire enough to allow for the specialized, gruesome work of the Recovery Intervention Team, the RIT, who arrived moments later, clad in thicker, specialized gear, their faces solemn masks of professional dread, the silent acknowledgement of their terrible task hanging heavy in the smoke-filled air. The next 3 hours were an agonizing, slow-motion blur of methodical destruction and grim discovery, a testament to the unyielding power of the fire and the devastating structural integrity of the collapse. The Clarksville crews, led by the methodical Sam, initially tried a probing, tactical entry through the back, but the internal devastation was absolute. The entire core of the house, now a molten, burning pit, necessitating the terrible, painful decision to transition to a pure defensive operation, fighting the fire until it was reduced to a controllable, smoking ruin, forcing the agonizing wait until the structure was safe enough to enter for the final, necessary search. The entire community, awakened by the relentless shriek of the sirens and the dark, towering plume of smoke visible for miles, began to arrive at the scene. The neighbors from Sycamore Ridge Road swelling the silent, horrified crowd on the perimeter, their shocked whispers and muted sobs joining the hiss of the hose lines and the mechanical whine of the pumps. The initial shock of the Thorne family's apparent death, now layered with the devastating, incomprehensible loss of the 2 firefighters, the town's protectors, the collective tragedy quickly morphing into a profound, existential wound that would scar the community for generations, a terrible, shared experience of loss and confusion. It was nearly 11 o'clock that morning, the sun high and cold in the blue Kentucky sky, the fire finally subdued into a smoking, steaming, unrecognizable heap of charred timber and ash, the air still thick with the chemical stench of fire, when the RIT team, moving with the heavy, reluctant grace of men performing a sacred, terrible duty, made the first confirmation of the victim's location, a terrible moment of forensic clarity brought about by the thermal imaging camera, cutting through the residual steam, revealing the inert shapes buried beneath the heavy mantle of collapsed roof and wall section. Tommy Rourke was the first recovered, his body terribly injured, tragically trapped, found exactly where the radio distress signal had suggested, his body positioned in a final protective posture over the spot where Danny had fallen, a silent, damning testament to his last, selfless act of leadership, the crushed, mangled condition of his lower leg, a horrifying indication of the immense, terminal force of the collapse that had sealed his fate and prevented his escape. The sight of the captain, the anchor of the Havenwood Volunteer Fire Department, being carried out, draped under a black canvas, his helmet missing, his face obscured by the soot and the trauma, broke the silent tension on the scene, triggering a fresh wave of public and professional grief. The Clarksville chief immediately ordering all personnel to salute, a solemn, unified gesture of respect and absolute sorrow, the sudden, terrible quiet of the moment, a final, agonizing acknowledgement of the ultimate sacrifice. Danny Hayes, the rookie, was recovered barely 20 minutes later, found just feet away, the cause of death confirmed quickly by the severe localized burns and internal trauma, the tragic irony of his youthful potential, the bright promise of his future, rendered to ash in the chaotic, unforgiving interior of a home he had tried in vain to save. The recovery of the firefighters, followed shortly by the grim retrieval of the Thorne family, the Reverend Elijah Thorne, his wife, and their 2 small children, found huddled together in what was left of the master bedroom, succumbing to smoke inhalation while awaiting a rescue that never came, marked the painful official end of the emergency phase and the terrifying immediate beginning of the investigative phase, the shift from firefighting to forensic science. From a crisis of nature to a potential crisis of human failure. Sam Jenkins, standing numbly by engine 1, the man who had lost his family twice in one morning, became the immediate, unwilling focal point of the nascent inquiry, the only surviving member of the initial attack team, his meticulously clean, grease-stained hands now trembling, his mind a fractured landscape of heat, smoke, and those final, agonizing moments of radio contact. His immediate, unsolicited testimony to the arriving state fire marshal's investigator, a somber, gray-haired man named Agent Douglas McMillan, was delivered with the dispassionate, mechanical precision that was Sam's emotional default, recounting the structural failure, the collapse of the stairs, the decision to retreat, the final mayday, the horrific, non-protocol scream of the rookie, a recitation of facts that sounded cold and inadequate even to his own ears. Every technical detail, a tiny, insufficient monument to the massive failure that had cost 4 civilian lives and 2 of the town's finest protectors. But the investigation, Agent McMillan's initial assessment of the horrific scene, quickly began to diverge from the expected terrible conclusion of accidental tragedy caused by structural failure. McMillan, a 20-year veteran of arson investigation, whose quiet demeanor masked a relentless, almost preternatural ability to read the subtle language of fire patterns, noticed almost immediately a series of deeply troubling anomalies that defied the simple explanation of a catastrophic electrical fault or a furnace malfunction. The fire, despite its massive, consuming nature, had exhibited a bizarre, localized intensity in the basement and the lower walls of the main floor, creating distinct V-shaped burn patterns, the classic, inescapable signature of rapid, accelerated vertical spread that were inconsistent with a slow burn ignition but were devastatingly consistent with the intentional use of a chemical accelerant. Furthermore, the sheer terminal speed of the fire's progression, the virtually instantaneous nature of the full structural involvement that had trapped the family and overwhelmed the responding team, spoke not to an accidental event, but to a deliberately engineered catastrophe, a professional, malicious act. The evidence, subtle and terrifying, was already being collected by the small, dedicated team of forensic technicians moving with slow, meticulous care through the steaming, smoking ruins, using specialized vapor sniffers and collection bags to gather the crucial, damning samples of deeply saturated soil and charred debris from the basement where the fire's intensity had been concentrated, samples that would soon confirm the terrible truth. The fire that had killed the Thorne family and the 2 firefighters was not a tragic accident of fate. It was an act of calculated, premeditated murder, a stunning, brutal realization that immediately escalated the investigation from a fire fatality review to a full-scale homicide investigation, thrusting the small, unsuspecting town of Havenwood into a cold, terrifying spotlight. The initial mourning for their lost heroes quickly complicated, and then completely overshadowed by the collective, paralyzing fear that the killer was not a distant abstraction, but a silent, hidden predator, now walking freely among them. Sam Jenkins, the last man standing, the witness to the final, agonizing moments of the victims' lives, immediately became the central, crucial, and tragically isolated figure in a cold case that would soon enter the terrifying, impenetrable fog of the unsolved. The revelation that the conflagration at Sycamore Ridge Road was not merely a catastrophic accident, but a meticulously executed act of arson, a stunning double homicide that claimed the lives of the Reverend Thorne, his family, and 2 of Havenwood's own, Captain Rourke and probationary firefighter Hayes, landed upon the grieving community with the brutal force of an emotional secondary collapse, a seismic shift in public perception that replaced collective sorrow with a cold, corrosive fear. Agent Douglas McMillan, the lead investigator from the State Fire Marshal's office, a man whose entire professional life was dedicated to discerning the subtle, intentional geometry of destruction, was the immovable anchor in the immediate aftermath. His quiet, methodical approach, a stark contrast to the escalating panic and the media frenzy that immediately descended upon the formerly peaceful Oldham County enclave. The preliminary findings, tragically confirmed by the specialized forensic lab reports from Frankfurt 3 days later, were devastatingly unequivocal. The presence of highly concentrated kerosene residues in the charred subfloor debris of the Thorne basement, particularly concentrated around the furnace and the main load-bearing wall, was irrefutable, an undeniable fingerprint of malice left by the perpetrator, transforming the ruins of the colonial house into a professional crime scene of the highest magnitude. McMillan's investigation, a painstaking, analytical dissection of the tragedy, quickly established 3 crucial, intertwined facts that would define the next 4 decades of the cold case. First, the accelerant had been poured and ignited in a deliberate, highly destructive pattern, designed not merely to start a fire, but to ensure the rapid, terminal compromise of the structure, maximizing the probability of immediate civilian casualties. Second, the windows on the main floor were found to have been partially blocked from the inside, a sickening, calculated measure to prevent any chance of escape by the trapped family, pointing to an intimate knowledge of the home's layout and the Thorne family's predictable routine. And third, the calculated timing of the ignition just before 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, a time when the community's volunteer department was just beginning its shift change, suggested a chillingly detailed awareness of the fire department's operating procedures, a level of hostile knowledge that narrowed the suspect pool to individuals with specific local connections, an unsettling implication that the killer was likely not an outsider, but a silent participant in the community's daily life, possibly even a familiar face to the victims or the responders themselves. The sole surviving member of the initial response team, Lieutenant Sam Jenkins, became, by terrible default, the central, most critical witness in the immediate days following the tragedy, his testimony sought relentlessly by McMillan's team. Every detail of the final, agonizing moments in the inferno scrutinized for clues to the perpetrator's identity or actions. Sam, still reeling from the shock and the guilt of survival, was now consumed by a relentless, self-assigned duty to provide the necessary forensic reconstruction of the collapse that had claimed his captain and his young protégé, his mind a steel trap of technical data and observational precision, focusing on the mechanical failure to avoid the emotional devastation of the human loss. He provided the investigators with the exact sequence of events: the initial assessment, the attempt at internal attack, the failure of the staircase, the mandated retreat, and the horrific immediate structural collapse that pinned Tommy and incapacitated Danny, the entire narrative delivered with the detached, clinical language of a mechanic troubleshooting a failed engine, the emotional core sealed off and protected by the fortress of his professional focus. However, Agent McMillan, a man who read people as closely as he read fire patterns, noted a crucial, unsettling tension in the lieutenant's testimony, an almost obsessive focus on the technical aspects of the apparatus and the collapse, a detailed account of the hose line pressure and the air consumption rates, while the description of the final critical moments, the exact nature of the rookie's agonizing scream, the precise location of Captain Rourke's fall, the identity of the structural element that finally pinned him, remained strangely vague, almost intentionally imprecise, as if the lieutenant's memory had erected a psychological roadblock at the point of maximum trauma. McMillan, whose experience had taught him that the most accurate witnesses often described the event in a rush of chaotic detail, found Sam's excessive mechanical composure highly suspicious, not necessarily of guilt, but certainly of concealment, a profound, unarticulated psychological burden that went beyond the normal, devastating trauma of witnessing a line-of-duty death. The investigator logged the inconsistency, a quiet, internal note that would remain a crucial, unresolved variable in the case file for decades. Why did the survivor, a man whose trade was meticulous detail, possess such a perfect memory for the insignificant, but a strangely obscured, almost defensive recollection of the moments that mattered most? The immediate aftermath saw the Havenwood Fire Department, the symbolic heart of the community, torn apart by the combined weight of grief, survivor's guilt, and the inescapable taint of the arson investigation. Sam Jenkins, promoted de facto to captain to manage the shell-shocked, understaffed department, found himself isolated by the very town he had sworn to protect. The public's initial outpouring of sympathy gradually giving way to a quiet, insidious suspicion, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air of the station house and the local diners. Why Sam? Why was he the only one to survive the hell inside the structure? The irony was a cruel twist of fate. Sam, who craved the deep familial acceptance of the fire department, suddenly found himself exiled by the very organization that had been his only home, forced to walk alone through the echoing silence of the engine bay, where Tommy's gear still hung in the locker, a silent, damning accusation. He buried himself in the department's mechanics, meticulously stripping down and rebuilding Engine 1, the very truck that had carried his friends to their death, cleaning every valve, polishing every chrome surface, a desperate physical attempt to find mechanical logic in the face of human irrationality, his grief manifesting not in tears or public lamentation, but in the relentless, almost pathological pursuit of technical perfection. A man trying to fix the unfixable, his entire world having become the sum of the damaged parts he was trying to restore. The initial aggressive phase of the homicide investigation, which spanned the following 9 months of 1984, yielded no definitive leads. The community, despite the tireless efforts of Macmillan and the Kentucky State Police, was either genuinely ignorant or defensively protective, the small-town code of silence proving to be an impenetrable shield for the killer. Suspects were interrogated, disgruntled former parishioners of Reverend Thorne, individuals with building code violations that Thorne had vocally opposed, even the few individuals known to have minor conflicts with the fire department leadership, but all avenues led to dead ends, the kerosene accelerant having performed its job with brutal, clean efficiency, leaving no clear traces of the perpetrator, no partial footprints, no discarded tool, no overlooked piece of DNA, the act of arson, a devastatingly efficient method of destroying both the victims and the evidence. The case, initially a screaming emergency on the police ledger, slowly, inevitably began its descent into the administrative purgatory of the cold case file. The investigation eventually scaled back, the constant presence of the state police replaced by the occasional haunting visit from Agent Macmillan, who could not, professionally or personally, let the impossible nature of the tragedy go. The memory of the 2 fallen men and the wiped-out family a permanent, nagging itch in his professional conscience. Decades passed, turning the shocking tragedy of October 11, 1983, from a fresh wound into a scar, a foundational, agonizing narrative woven into the very identity of Havenwood. The Thorne Colonial was eventually demolished, leaving behind a stark, grassy field that remained stubbornly vacant, a permanent, empty monument to loss and unsolved mystery, a silent, enduring testament to the town's shattered equilibrium. Captain Thomas Rourke's widow, Sarah, raised their 3 children, never remarrying, her life a poignant public testament to her unwavering, monumental grief and the community's failure to provide justice. Her eldest son, eventually following his father into the fire service, carrying the heavy weight of his legacy. Sam Jenkins, the survivor, remained with the department, his competence undeniable, his presence a permanent melancholy fixture, the dark cloud of the unsolved mystery clinging to him like the soot he could never quite scrub from his hands, eventually ascending to the position of fire chief, a rank he wore with the weary, joyless solemnity of a man who knew he was merely holding a chair for a better man, his social isolation deepening with the years, his entire existence a quiet, lonely act of repentance for a crime he didn't commit but couldn't solve, his mechanical obsession only intensifying, a man entombed by the past. Agent Macmillan, unable to let go, officially retired from the fire marshal's office in 2008, but his personal file on the Rourke-Thorne case, meticulously organized, annotated with his own theories and unanswered questions, remained active, a quiet testament to a professional lifetime of unrelenting pursuit, the case file aging with him, the paper yellowing, the ink fading, the mystery hardening into an almost unbreakable, crystalline truth. The passage of time, the ultimate indifferent executioner, had allowed the killer to disappear entirely, to become a quiet shadow, hidden in plain sight, protected by the very silence and trust of the community they had so violently betrayed. The terrifying, agonizing knowledge that the perpetrator of the century's most devastating crime was likely still a neighbor, still a familiar face at the grocery store, still a voice in the local church, a malignant presence embedded deep within the unsuspecting framework of Havenwood, waiting, silently and patiently, for the final, cold embrace of oblivion to grant them ultimate, unearned impunity. But science, the cold, dispassionate arbiter of truth, was preparing its own, decades-long, slow-motion ambush, an inevitable convergence of technological breakthrough and human obsession that would eventually crack the unbreakable case, transforming the yellowed, static-filled testimony of a traumatized lieutenant into a final, undeniable proof, pulling the silent killer from the safety of the past and into the blinding, unforgiving unforgiving light of the present. The decades-long stasis of the Rourke-Thorne case, frozen in the administrative cold storage of the Kentucky State Police archives, was finally shattered in the early months of 2018, not by a sudden confession or the discovery of a new witness, but by the quiet, methodical revolution of forensic technology, a convergence of genetic science and digital genealogy that provided the cold case division with a power previously relegated to the realm of speculative fiction. The catalyst for this seismic shift was the relentless tenacity of Agent Macmillan, now a frail but intellectually sharp octogenarian, who, utilizing his personal and professional connections, had successfully lobbied the state police to revisit the most crucial and, until then, most baffling piece of physical evidence recovered from the 1983 fire scene: a single, minute piece of tissue, roughly the size of a fingernail, found embedded in the charred heel of Captain Rourke's bunker boot during the autopsy, a foreign biological fragment that had been meticulously preserved for 35 years in a temperature-controlled vault, labeled simply as Miscore Biological from Victim 1. At the time of the fire, the technology to extract and amplify usable DNA from such a small, thermally compromised sample was non-existent, but the advent of sophisticated single-cell amplification techniques and the rise of commercial genetic genealogy databases offered a slender, unprecedented possibility. The sample was submitted to a private, specialized forensic lab in Texas, a facility known for its success with decades-old, degraded evidence. The results, returned in the summer of 2018, were nothing short of miraculous. The lab successfully isolated a full, usable YSTR profile, a unique genetic signature inherited exclusively down the paternal line, confirming that the tissue belonged not to any of the victims, nor the responding firefighters, but to a previously unknown, unidentified male, an individual who had been within the immediate, internal vicinity of Captain Rourke's final position, placing him inside the structure at or around the time of the fatal collapse, a finding that immediately transformed the entire trajectory of the investigation. The implications were chilling and immediate. This man was either an unrecorded civilian who perished in the fire but was never found, a possibility quickly discounted by the thoroughness of the original recovery efforts, or more terrifyingly, he was the perpetrator, a silent, unseen participant in the arson who had inadvertently left his own biological signature embedded in the protective gear of his victim. A final, catastrophic mistake made in the chaotic seconds of his departure. A piece of himself torn off and preserved by the very equipment designed to save others. The new DNA profile, the digital ghost of the killer, was uploaded into the rapidly expanding Integrated Genetic Genealogy (IgG) database, a cutting-edge technique where police utilize publicly available consumer DNA databases to identify potential relatives of the perpetrator, creating an enormous digital family tree that funnels the investigation toward the unknown subject. Within 6 weeks, the system generated a viable lead, a third cousin match residing in upstate New York, an elderly woman whose distant paternal lineage shared the same unique YSTR marker as the tissue found on Captain Rourke's boot. Working backward, utilizing census records, birth certificates, and obituaries, the State Police Genealogical Investigative Unit meticulously constructed the relevant branch of the family tree, tracing the shared paternal line back 2 centuries, eventually narrowing the field to a cluster of 4 living male suspects residing in the greater Kentucky region, all sharing the same rare genetic fingerprint, all descended from a common great-great-grandfather. A monumental breakthrough that finally provided the investigation with 4 living names to attach to the spectral presence in the fire's ruins. The most promising and immediately unsettling name on the final list was that of 43-year-old Walter "Wally" Hicks, a local business owner residing just 5 miles outside of Havenwood, a man with no prior criminal record, a well-known quiet figure in the community, whose ancestry placed him definitively on the familial branch that carried the unique YSTR marker. The investigation into Hicks, initially conducted discreetly under the highest level of secrecy, immediately revealed a constellation of circumstantial facts that, while individually benign, collectively formed a deeply troubling pattern of association. Wally Hicks had been a high school classmate of Danny Hayes, the deceased rookie, though they were not close friends. More crucially, Hicks had been a longtime member of the Havenwood Community Church, where the Reverend Thorne had been the pastor, a regular attendee of the morning service, placing him in the victim's close circle. And most damningly, he had been a volunteer auxiliary member of the Havenwood Volunteer Fire Department in 1983, a non-active role that required him to attend regular department meetings, assist with fundraising, and critically gave him intimate, first-hand knowledge of the station's shift schedules, apparatus locations, and the specific, predictable response times for the Sycamore Ridge Road address. The realization was a devastating culmination of Agent Macmillan's decades-old suspicion. The killer was not only a local, but had possessed an insider's knowledge, a deeply corrosive irony that cut to the very heart of the community's trust. The investigation quietly intensified into a full-scale surveillance operation. Agent Macmillan, pulled from retirement to serve as a high-level consultant, focused his efforts on the single, final piece of evidence necessary for an arrest, a confirmatory DNA sample from Walter Hicks. The opportunity presented itself 3 weeks later at a local town council meeting, where Hicks, a known chain smoker, absent-mindedly discarded a half-smoked cigarette butt into a public ash receptacle outside the municipal building. A plainclothes detective, moving with trained forensic precision, retrieved the cigarette butt, which was immediately rushed to the state police lab. The results, returned with urgent priority status 48 hours later, delivered the final, non-negotiable proof. The highly specific DNA profile extracted from the saliva on the cigarette butt was an absolute 100% match to the YSTR and mitochondrial DNA profile of the biological tissue found embedded in the boot of Captain Rourke. The circle was closed, the cold case was solved. The arrest of Walter Hicks, executed with quiet professional efficiency at his auto repair shop at 7:00 a.m. on a crisp, cloudless Thursday morning in October 2018, exactly 35 years and 3 days after the fatal fire, sent a devastating, paralyzing shockwave through the small community, a psychic rupture that exceeded even the original tragedy. Hicks, the quiet neighbor, the church attendee, the former auxiliary volunteer, the man who had even participated in the memorial fundraising drive for the fallen firefighters in 1984, was the killer, a predator hiding in plain sight for 3.5 decades, his secret maintained by the passage of time and the limitations of technology. The collective realization that they had shared coffee, waved greetings, and lived alongside the individual responsible for the town's greatest tragedy was a profound, irreversible violation of trust, a corrosive destruction of the very concept of neighborly safety. For Sam Jenkins, the now grizzled 58-year-old fire chief, the news was not merely a shock, but a devastating, seismic realignment of his entire world, a final, brutal clarification of the trauma he had carried for 35 years. He immediately requested a private, unscripted meeting with Hicks, an arrangement granted by the state police lead detective, in a controlled, supervised environment at the Oldham County Detention Center, a necessary confrontation for the sole survivor. When Sam, his face a mask of weary, contained rage, finally stood before the man who had murdered his captain and his rookie, and whose actions had consumed the life of the Thorne family and subsequently shattered Sam's own life into an isolated existence of mechanical repair, the emotional dam he had constructed for 3 decades finally, violently broke. He didn't shout or accuse. Instead, he simply stared at Hicks, his voice a low, raw whisper of pure, cold disbelief. "The boot, Wally? Why was your skin on Tommy's boot?" The question was the culmination of his life's pain, a desperate plea for the logic he had always sought. Hicks, a man whose facade of quiet competence had instantly collapsed under the weight of the arrest, now simply stared back, his eyes vacant, his composure utterly gone, offering only the pathetic, chilling confirmation of a man whose long-guarded secret had finally devoured him. "He was on the ground. I had to step over him, Sam. I had to step over him to get out." The statement, delivered with a flat, emotionless finality, confirmed the terrible truth that Macmillan had long suspected, a truth that had been hidden within the terrifying vagueness of Sam's original testimony. Hicks had been in the collapsing house, not to help but to witness or to ensure the finality of the destruction, and in his panicked flight from the fire's terminal surge, he had literally trod upon the body of the captain who had rushed in to save the victims, his flesh torn by the boot's protective edge, the smallest of forensic errors, the most colossal of human betrayals. The recovery of Tommy's body and the protective posture he was found in had created the perfect biological time capsule for the killer's DNA, an infinitesimal piece of evidence preserved by the ultimate sacrifice, a 35-year path to an undeniable justice. The final, agonizing piece of the puzzle, the motive for the horrific mass murder, still remained buried, awaiting the final confrontation in a court of law. But the who, the where, and the undeniable scientific certainty were now terrifyingly clear, transforming the cold case from an atmospheric mystery into a tragic living example of forensic salvation. The trial of Walter "Wally" Hicks, which commenced in the Oldham County Circuit Court in the spring of 2019, became not just a legal proceeding, but a public, agonizing autopsy of Havenwood's shattered sense of self, a forensic reliving of the town's darkest day and the subsequent 4 decades of collective, silent grief. The prosecution's case, meticulously constructed by the Commonwealth attorney, was a devastating synthesis of Agent Macmillan's decades of behavioral observation and the irrefutable cold clarity of modern genetic science, creating an evidentiary rope that tightened inexorably around the quiet, unremarkable defendant. The narrative presented was a chronological masterpiece of investigative storytelling, beginning with the serene, deceptive normalcy of October 11, 1983, and culminating in the definitive absolute DNA match confirmed by the saliva sample taken 35 years later. The pivotal moment of the trial arrived with the methodical presentation of the forensic evidence. The lead DNA analyst from the State Police Lab, speaking with detached clinical authority, detailed the successful extraction of the Y-STR profile from the minute piece of skin tissue preserved in the sole of Captain Rourke's bunker boot, explaining to the captivated jury how the physical act of the killer's panicked flight, the necessity of stepping over the downed captain, had created the perfect biological time capsule, a catastrophic mistake by the perpetrator that became the final, undeniable proof of his presence and guilt. But the core challenge of the prosecution remained the decades-old agonizing question of motive, the incomprehensible why that drove a seemingly unremarkable auxiliary fire department volunteer and devoted church attendee to commit the brutal, planned mass murder of a beloved pastor and his family, and, indirectly, two town heroes. This chilling gap was finally bridged by the testimony of Sam Jenkins, who, now fully unburdened by the crushing isolation of survival and the fear of the unknown, took the stand as the prosecution's final, most powerful witness. Sam, no longer the detached mechanic of the 1983 inquiry, recounted not just the technical details of the response, but the painful, human moments he had been forced to suppress. The horrifying, unprofessional scream of Danny Hayes just before the collapse, the metallic taste of fear, and the final, haunting stillness that followed Tommy's crushed Mayday call. He then delivered the devastating, emotional punch, recounting his private confrontation with Hicks in the detention center, repeating the killer's cold, chilling admission. "He was on the ground. I had to step over him, Sam. I had to step over him to get out." This admission, though hearsay, provided the jury with the necessary confirmation. Hicks was inside the house while the family and firefighters were dying, a silent observer and participant, not a rescuer, a man whose intimate, insider knowledge of the emergency response sequence allowed him to plan his exit with malicious confidence, a fatal confidence that led to the microscopic forensic error that would ultimately destroy him. However, the final, crucial piece of the motive puzzle was unlocked through the painstaking analysis of Reverend Thorne's financial and ministerial records. The prosecution introduced evidence, initially dismissed in 1983, proving that Wally Hicks, who owned a struggling auto repair business, was deeply in debt, on the verge of bankruptcy, and had been secretly embezzling a significant sum of money from the Havenwood Community Church's building fund over the course of several years, a complex financial deception that had only months left before it would be discovered by the annual external audit. Reverend Thorne, a man of uncompromising moral principle, had, according to recent correspondence recovered from his home office archives, correspondence he was planning to present to the church deacons on the day of the fire, discovered the exact nature and extent of Hicks's theft, and had scheduled a meeting with Hicks for that very Tuesday morning to confront him privately, a final pastoral attempt at correction before taking the necessary disciplinary action. The motive, therefore, was not passion or revenge, but the cold, cynical desperation of an ordinary man protecting his secret, his reputation, and his freedom from the social and legal ruin that exposure would bring. Hicks had orchestrated the fire, intentionally destroying the Thorne family to silence the witness to his crime, and timed the act to coincide with the fire department's shift change to maximize chaos and delay the response, an ultimate murderous act of self-preservation. The jury, having been taken on a precise, agonizing journey from the silent scene of the fire to the scientific proof of the DNA, and finally to the cold, undeniable logic of the financial motive, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts of arson, felony murder, and manslaughter in the line of duty after less than 4 hours of deliberation. The courtroom, packed with the surviving family members, Captain Rourke's grown children, Sarah Rourke, and the remaining members of the Havenwood Fire Department, including Chief Sam Jenkins, erupted not in shouts of joy, but in a wave of quiet, profound, melancholy relief, the end of a multi-generational period of agonizing uncertainty. Wally Hicks was immediately sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. The conviction brought a devastating final conclusion to the case, yet the sense of resolution for Havenwood remained complex and bittersweet. The community, finally having justice for the 6 souls lost, was left with the painful, enduring wound of betrayal, the realization that the greatest danger had not come from an external force, but from within their own trusted circle. The decades decades-long silence and the lack of accountability had allowed the killer to blend back into the fabric of the town, forcing them to question every neighborly smile, every casual interaction, a fundamental, irreparable damage to their collective trust that time alone could not fully heal. For Sam Jenkins, the quiet, isolated survivor, the conviction represented a liberation, a final necessary exorcism of the trauma that had haunted his professional life and isolated his personal existence. The burden of the ambiguous tragedy was lifted, the shame of survival replaced by the clarity of the truth, the confirmation that the failures of 1983 were not his but the perpetrator's calculated design. With the case finally closed, the truth finally laid bare, Sam, the perpetual fireman, felt the cold weight of his uniform finally lift. He announced his immediate retirement as fire chief, his final act being the establishment of a memorial scholarship in the names of Captain Rourke and Danny Hayes, a foundation dedicated to the advancement of forensic science in the service of cold case investigation, ensuring that the legacy of their ultimate sacrifice would be a force for future justice. He finally found a quiet, dignified peace, a life no longer defined by the fire's terrible memory, but by the determined professional pursuit of the truth, the slow-burn resolution of a cold case that had devoured 4 decades and redefined the very soul of a small Kentucky town. The ghost of the Sycamore Ridge Road fire was finally, undeniably put to rest. The finalization of the legal process, the mandatory appeals exhausted, the last judicial door slammed shut on the petition of Walter Hicks, did not, as the residents of Havenwood might have wished, immediately cleanse the town of the 40-year-old psychic residue left by the Sycamore Ridge Road fire. Instead, the conclusive guilt of a neighbor, a man who had broken bread with them and participated in the very memorials for his victims, triggered a prolonged period of agonizing social detoxification, a forced re-evaluation of the core tenets of small-town intimacy. The revelation that Hicks's motive was the cold preservation of his financial fraud, a crime of white-collar desperation covered by an act of mass murder, stripped the tragedy of any grand, understandable rationale, leaving behind only the chilling banality of his evil, forcing the town to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that profound wickedness can wear the mask of utter normalcy, hidden in plain sight. The empty lot where the Thorne Colonial once stood, the intentional absence of structure, a grim, perpetual scar on the idyllic landscape, finally found its purpose in the year following the trial. It was purchased by a consortium of Havenwood residents, led by Sarah Rourke, the captain's widow, and the surviving members of the Rourke family, and formally dedicated as the Havenwood 6 Memorial, an understated geometric garden of reflection built from salvaged river stones and marked by 6 upright granite slabs, each bearing the name of a victim, a permanent physical repudiation of the emptiness that the crime had sought to enforce. The simple, unadorned design was a conscious rejection of grandiosity, a quiet monument to the dignity of the lives that had been extinguished and the brutal simplicity of the truth finally revealed. The most profound, yet quietest transformation occurred in the life of Sam Jenkins, the former fire chief. Retirement for a man whose identity had been forged in the crucible of perpetual preparedness and mechanical precision was initially a period of paralyzing disorientation. For decades, the unsolved nature of the crime had been the shadow that defined him, the ambiguous trauma that served as both his curse and his strange, isolating purpose. With the truth resolved, that purpose vanished, leaving behind the empty silence of a life stripped bare of its central conflict. He moved out of his bachelor apartment above the auto shop, the very place where he had spent a life fixing things that could be fixed, and purchased a small, quiet property near the Ohio River, a place where the pervasive scent of diesel and fire-dampened wood was replaced by the clean, wet smell of the moving water and the heavy, humid earth. His final professional act, the establishment of the Rourke-Hayes Cold Case Forensic Scholarship, evolved into his new, personal mission. Sam dedicated himself entirely to the foundation, utilizing his mechanical mind not for fixing engines, but for organizing, fundraising, and most importantly, for mentoring the young, newly minted forensic science graduates who received the funding, pushing them toward careers in DNA analysis and genealogical investigation. In these young minds, eager to apply the new science to old injustices, Sam found a clean, unburdened reflection of the potential that had been tragically extinguished in Danny Hayes, and a way to honor the unwavering commitment to justice that had defined Tommy Rourke. He finally learned to speak of the fire not as the moment of his failure, but as the origin point of a larger, ongoing pursuit of truth, an understanding that transformed his survivor's guilt into a quiet, enduring form of advocacy. His relationship with Sarah Rourke, long strained by the unspoken traumatic bond between the survivor and the bereaved, entered a new, tender phase of mutual respect and shared memory. They were the two constants, the twin pillars who had carried the weight of the case for 35 years, and now, In their later lives, they shared the unique, quiet companionship of having navigated the same existential storm, meeting regularly at the Memorial Garden, speaking of Tommy and Danny and the Thorne family, not with the agonizing grief of 1983, but with the warm, resolved melancholy of those who have seen justice delivered. The irony was not lost on Sam. In the profound solitude that the crime had forced upon him, he had finally found an enduring human connection rooted not in fire, but in the slow, healing work of shared remembrance. The town of Havenwood, too, eventually moved forward, accepting the dark chapter not as a definition of their character, but as a critical test of their resilience. The Havenwood Volunteer Fire Department, profoundly reorganized after the retirement of Sam Jenkins, instituted new, mandatory training protocols focused explicitly on scene contamination and the preservation of biological evidence, a permanent institutional acknowledgement that every fire scene must be treated as a potential crime scene until definitively proven otherwise. The department's standard operating procedures, subtly but irreversibly revised by the tragic wisdom of their history. The memory of the Kentucky 1983 cold case became a permanent cautionary tale, whispered not in fear, but as a quiet, sobering reminder of the power of time, the relentless reach of science, and the ultimate, inescapable triumph of truth over deception. A final, necessary victory that allowed the town to finally, slowly, and permanently begin the arduous, quiet work of healing.